right. So today, I wanted to introduce you all to a brand new city. I know that we're all familiar with New Haven, but today we're going to be visiting a place called New Brain. And yes, this is all going to be in your head. So to start things off, before I get into the actual science of it, we're usually asked to make an introduction. And so I just wanted to introduce myself. I know they mentioned that I was an MD PhD. It's kind of hard to envision though. And I like to think of myself actually as the intersection of being a scientist, a doctor, and then also an engineer. Um, the reason for this actually is that when I was a undergrad, I actually majored in material science and engineering before coming to Yale, where I'm now in the neuroscience department. And in medicine, I hope to become a child neurologist. So this all is all really just to say you can honestly do whatever you want, and long and winding paths are definitely a thing. You might wonder actually, how exactly does material science and engineering and neuroscience even like correlate at all? And the answer is actually what you're going to learn today, the brain extracellular matrix. And so without further ado, let us start building the city of New Brain. Um, so to start off, it's pretty probably well agreed upon that the brain is very, very complicated. And in general, folks talk about there's a lot of different cell types in the brain. There's a lot of little sparks that fly around. There's a lot of different ways people describe the brain. Um, but today, I want you to think of the brain as like a city. So within a city, there's actually a lot of parts to it. And usually when we think of it, you think about like your typical New Yorker, or your Bostonian, or your New Havener, right? There's obviously very distinct characteristics that we think of these folks. And also we really think about the people a lot. But there's actually a lot more to just that, right? And obviously I will not deny the people and everything that the people do are probably the most important part of the city. Without it, there's not really anything. However, when we also think about cities, right, we think about the New York skyline, right? Or we think about the Eiffel Tower in Paris. Basically, every city also needs some sort of structural framework, your homes, your buildings, your plumbing, your internet. All of this stuff allows us to be able to live safely, and allows us to be able to, function well and function with each other. And so that's kind of the basis for how we're going to learn about the extracellular matrix today. And we're going to go through a lot of different parts, and I encourage everyone to throw out into the chat things that they think is similar to what we're talking about today. So, yes, the brain is made of many cells. Once again, I don't want you to get in trouble with your science teachers. If your science teachers start teaching about the brain, they will tell you it's made out of cells. I do not deny that. However, if you start thinking about it, within the cells, in the brain or really anywhere in the body, right? There's some really important things that they have to be able to do. They have to know, where they are relative to other cells, right? You need to be able to contact other cells, talk to that section of the brain, 15 gazillion cells away, right? There has to be some sort of system. They also have to be able to stay put. It's very important that if I shake my head, that all my cells don't go flying, to the side of my skull. It is actually quite important. And this is true for the rest of the body. There's a lot of different structures that keep our cells where they are. But the brain has a bit of a unique composition, in part because of just how both fragile and robust the way our brain cells are kind of organized. And then the other thing is that cells can move around, and parts of cells can move around, right? If you see these like long little like pointy bits on the cells, these are what we call axons and dendrites, and they connect to each other to talk to each other. And so, the name isn't important, but what's most important is to think about, like how exactly do cells know how to get to another cell? And so these are all really, really important characteristics, right, of any system, but in the brain, it is especially important. Um, and so the answer to all these questions is that the brain is made out of more than just cells. There's actually a lot of stuff going on in the background. Um, and in fact, the brain is made out of 20% of all this stuff that's not cells. And so what we call this is the extracellular matrix. Now, I know that that is a big handful to say, and it's also a really, really long word. So I'm going to break it down in a way that hopefully you all should remember, be able to remember. So it is a long word, us in biology, though we'd like to have a little bit of a system to it. So actually, if you break down the word, and you'll find that this is helpful sometimes in looking at other things in biology, we tend to use the same sorts of bits of words and put them together. The word extra in extracellular means outside. The second half, cellular, can you folks guess what that refers to? Yes, the cells. That is exactly right. Um, we try not to be too complicated in biology. And then the last thing is matrix, which, you might think of like Matrix the movie, a lot of different things like to be called matrix. In this context, honestly, matrix just means stuff. And so, in short, we can think of extracellular matrix. If you literally translate the bits of it, it just means stuff outside cells. So it is the equivalent of everything that your cells need to live. Us as people, we need houses, roads, electricity, plumbing, internet, all of this stuff. And your cells need this kind of stuff too. So let's get into it. Time to start building the city of new brain. So you can liken the building of, some of the different parts of the extracellular matrix to building a house. It's not, literal one for one per se, but there's a lot of similarities actually. And so we're gonna take this image and break it down bit by bit. And hopefully by the end, you should be able to understand all the different parts. So the first part we're gonna talk about is this like gray, tangly looking stuff in the background. And so this is what's called elastic. It's very stretchy. It can take quite a bit of a hit, and it's very, very robust. What do you think the equivalent might be in building a house? One hint is that it's the first thing that we're kind of thinking about in building the house. The foundation, base. Yep. So the last thing we can think of it as part of the foundation of the extracellular matrix. The next thing are these really interesting proteins that we call collagens. And so collagens are actually super duper prevalent in your body overall, right? Like the reason why my skin is stretchy, right? Or the reason why I'm able to, move my muscles around and all this stuff. All of these are actually made out of collagen. Even like the cartilage in your nose, right? Collagen is involved in all of this stuff. So it's a really, really important protein. In the brain, as well as providing some structure to the brain, collagens are a really, really important part of our blood vessels and of part of what we call this like basement membrane. And so what would you say this is kind of analogous to in building a house? Basic springs, plumbing, basement. And I want to say that y'all are right. Plumbing, blood vessels are kind of an important part of our brain. Someone asked, how do you get water? So, how does the brain get blood? The brain actually gets blood from the heart, just like everywhere else in the body. And the brain is actually a huge hog of blood from the heart, right? A lot of the blood actually will just go straight from the heart up to your brain. So it gets top priority and, it uses up a lot of our energy. And so our plumbing in the brain is actually quite important. But in addition to that, it also helps just kind of form a foundation. And this basement membrane is something that basically a lot of cells can kind of help to organize themselves. However, this isn't quite enough to constitute, like a house, right? So the next thing is something that we call laminates. So laminates can, kind of be attached to these collagens and to other things like structural things that are in the brain extracellular matrix. And their most important function is that it's actually an attachment point for other cells and other structures. Um, and so, they themselves might not necessarily be super structural, but you can think of it as something for everything else to start connecting to. So yes, the brain actually does take 20% of the oxygen that your body takes. It is quite the hog of your resources, but that's because it's really, really important. It does a lot of stuff. So I see nails. That's a good one. Framework, structure, internet, structures and beings. Yep. So in this case, we're going to go with saying that it's similar to the house frame, right? Where we kind of, this sits on top of our, floor and our plumbing, and our foundation, but it itself is not, necessarily the walls. But a lot of stuff we're going to start connecting to it later. So the next thing we're going to talk about, that's important. I want to kind of group them together because they're a little similar, and their full functionality, I think, is still yet to be understood. But there's these compounds called hyaluronan and proteoglycans. And basically what these do is that these molecules are often, like proteins and things like that, that have groups on them that are very good at attracting and holding on to water. And you might think, oh, what do we need so much water in the brain for? And the answer is water actually makes for a very, very good cushion, right? So if you think about if you've ever had like a water balloon or anything filled with water and you try to squeeze it, right? You squeeze one side, the other side gets bigger. It just takes a finite amount of volume and can take a small amount of pressure. And so the equivalent in your house might be, I see insulation. Any other thoughts? Walls, yep. Outer shell, skeleton, yep. So we're gonna go with walls. Yeah, the exterior of our house, the walls. And so this is a really, really important part of the brain, and a lot of the brain is going to be made out of these. Someone asked, where did parts of the brain get their names from? Some of it actually comes, so some of them actually come from like where they are on, in your head. So for instance, we call this part of the skull, the like parietal plate, I believe, or something like that. And this is the parietal lobe. If you ever heard someone say like, oh, like I have a headache around my temples or something like that, this is called your temples. And underneath it are these lobes of the brain called temporal lobes. So a good number of the parts of the different parts of the brain are named after, where they are basically. All right. So the next thing are signaling molecules. So signaling molecules are basically stuff that cells excrete that allow them to talk to each other. And so this is, of course, also quite important. We might think about talking to each other as something to help pass the time, but also, in the context of a city or doing anything, you need to communicate with each other to be able to, build a city or to build a house. It's very, very important to be able to do anything that requires more effort than just what your two hands can do. And so in the brain, signaling molecules can be released for cells to talk to each other about, oh, they want to send a signal along, but it also can sometimes these signaling molecules are released as sort of like a homing beacon. And so sometimes there'll be different parts of the brain that is excrete certain molecules, and by detecting those molecules, you'll be able to know where you kind of are in the brain. And so that's and helps to answer the question of how do cells know where they are. Can folks think of what that's kind of similar to? Yep, probably everyone's favorite, the internet. So yeah, it's super duper important. The next thing are ions. So there's actually a lot of ions in the brain, and these ions that float around are actually super duper important as well. So a lot of your cells, they basically have their particular shape and their particular properties in part because of the concentration, so the amount of ions that are inside the cell compared to what's outside the cell. So making sure that these concentrations and these amounts of these, little particles, these little ions, is really, really important for cells to be able to just function on a basic level, right? They need specific ion concentrations to be able to make energy. They needed to be able to send signals to each other. They needed to be able to even just sustain their shape. Because if there's too much, for instance, stuff on the outside of the cell, then all the water goes and chases that instead of staying in the cell. And then, your cells can implode or explode depending on where the ions are. And so this is really kind of trying to help make the environment around the cells comfortable. Um, so any thoughts on what this is kind of similar to in the house? Yep. Electricity, roof. Yep. These are all important. Food, roof, food. Anyone ever feel cold in the winter? It's a little hard to be functional when you're freezing your toes off. But yes, these are all kind of, you can think of them as basically the utilities of the house: electricity, heat, home interior, furniture, things that you want to sit on, be functional with. They're quite important. Now, the next thing that I want to address is not quite the extracellular matrix, but it is an important thing that isn't, specific to brain cells. And that's what we call the blood-brain barrier. So we can think of all the blood vessels. All the blood vessels in the brain are particularly unique because what they do is that they, bunch up against each other and produce stuff to create what we call this blood-brain barrier. And this is really important because blood vessels are basically one of the most important ways the brain can even communicate or understand what's going on in the rest of the body, right? But also, like I said before, ion concentrations are very sensitive and they're very important. You don't want to willy-nilly let anything into the brain because it's such an important structure. And so we call it the blood-brain barrier because we hope that it will help protect the brain against random stuff that you don't want in there. It's very, very what we call selective. But in addition to that, right, it is an important kind of gatekeeper for us to be able to communicate with the rest of the body and for the body to communicate to us. So any thoughts on what that's kind of similar to in a house? Roof, windows, doors. Yep. So windows, doors, exterior. These are all super duper important. And this is how, you know what's going on in the outside world. And then the last thing, it's not quite part of a house, but it is something that I want to address. Whoops, are these perineural nets. And so these are basically little bits of extracellular matrix that surround neuronal cell bodies. And so we can think of it like clothes because certain neurons have, need to fire really quickly or have some sort of special way to be able to quickly adjust its outside environment. And so these perineural nets that kind of sit explicitly tightly around a neuron, we think I say we think because research can show, many different things from now until when you are all in grad school or beyond. Um, we think that it has something to do with help regulate the environment immediately around the neuron. So similar to how, we wear clothes because it'd be really cold without it or really hot without it, depending on where you are. Um, and so we like to pick our clothes, in part to show who we are, but also environmentally, it is also quite helpful. And so with that, um, we have built our extracellular matrix. And now we're all ready to populate it with cells and have a party. I see a lot of text notes popping up. I don't know where that is from. There you go. And so just one last thing. You may wonder, like, all right, so we just went through all the different parts of this extracellular matrix thing, but why is it important? And so the reason why it's important actually is that a lot of diseases have altered the extracellular matrix, and changes in this extracellular matrix can both be a cause and effect of disease, right? So if we think about healthy brain tissue, there's a certain rhyme and reason to the way that it's organized. And this allows cells to be healthy, to be able to function well. However, if they stop functioning well, or they start doing things they're not supposed to, right? If you think about someone going wild in a house, you can start destroying bits of the house, and that's not good. And so one example is cancer. GBM, glioblastoma, is a very, very aggressive tumor that can affect the brain. And it's been seen that in these little tumor areas, the extracellular matrix is just totally messed up. The same way that if someone went around, hitting a bat to everything, or if there are just way too many people in your house party, your house would get destroyed. But on top of that, if you are in a super duper damaged house, for whatever reason, the windows are shut, your computer is broken, there's nowhere to sit, you also wouldn't be very functional as a person. It would kind of suck to try to do your homework there. And so I say that it can be both a cause and effect of disease because extracellular matrix that is messed up in some way or form can also cause cells to dysfunction. And so it can cause basically disease of the brain. And so it's important to study and to know about this because it can be such an integral part of understanding, how we are healthy and also how we get sick. And so with that, I would like to thank you all for listening. And I think after this, we will be having an activity.
All right.
All right.
So we have four main questions.
Okay.
One of the first questions is how are brain cells created?
How are brain cells created? That's a good question. The full answer is very long and complicated, and I think still under research. But basically, so basically, folks probably know, it's all about the egg and sperm meeting each other, and then, you embed in the body. At this point, in the very first stages of the cell, basically starting to divide, we actually form three different layers. And then within those layers, the top layer that eventually forms our skin and whatnot also forms our brain. And so there's certain little sections of cells that go through a couple of different stages. So we call them like radioglia, intermediate progenitors, and then eventually they start dividing and turning into the final stage of their cell disc. So sometimes that's what we call neurons. Some of them are astrocytes. Some of them are oligodendrocytes. Some of them just stay as babies. But yeah, that's kind of the basic gist of it.
You. Another question that people had was what happens when we don't have the stuff that the extracellular matrix needs, when we can't produce that?
To be honest, if you truly didn't have it from all the way when you were a baby, you probably weren't viable as a baby, unfortunately. If you really lacked everything. In the stages where your brain is first forming, and actually, they say the fetal brain is actually 40% extracellular matrix. If you don't have the correct components or if they're not in the correct like places, then it can interfere with the way your brain starts to organize itself and structure itself. Later on, sometimes people have like a stroke and that destroys that area of the brain. It just means that you really just can't kind of recover that area. And in some other contexts, it can lead to, different diseases and things, depending on what you're missing. And, like at what stage you're missing it and things like that.
Another person asked if plant or mushroom-like networks are similar to neural networks or networks in the brain.
That's a really interesting question. I'm probably not the most qualified to give an answer to this. I think that they're probably a little bit different though. So plants and I guess mushrooms as well, right? They usually like kind of descend from like you take like a single root and then it kind of starts spreading outwards. And the goal of these are kind of just to be able to spread outwards as much as possible to be able to gather as many nutrients as possible and things like that. The brain, though, all of this like complicated webbing and things like that, the purpose of that is a little bit different, right? Neurons need to be able to talk to each other, but you can't have everyone talking at once, right? You want to have certain neurons be connected to certain other neurons in order to be able to form, these networks that can then hold or process some kind of information. And so since the function is a little bit different, it's less so like free for all, let's try to, get as much stuff as possible, and more like a very precisely trimmed set of plants, per se. Basically, you can't have everything connected to each other because then that's like everyone talking at once. You have to pick and choose. And so there are specific ways that the neurons and the cells in the brain actually kind of cut back on certain areas. So there's like a precise rhyme and reason basically for how these networks are structured.
Okay, thank you. Someone wants to know why you decided to study the brain. What led you there?
Oh, this is a really funny story. So back when I was probably around your age, depending on how old you are, admittedly, this was back in middle school. I had this stint where I was really, really interested in physics. So I really liked watching Discovery Channel, and they had all these physics documentaries all the time. And I thought it was really cool. So I went to look for books about it. And I read a couple of them. And then at some point, I was like, all this stuff is about like universe, string theory, stuff like that. And, it's kind of out over my head. I kind of just want to learn about like really basic physics, like Newtonian mechanics, what they call it. Like if you hit something, this something will go forward, stuff like that, momentum, all that stuff. And so I found this book called Newton's Madness. And seeing that it was called Newton, I thought it was about physics. As it turns out, I missed the fact that there's a subtitle that said Further Tales of Clinical Neurology. And the book actually ended up being all about people with different brain conditions and different brain diseases. And even though it was not physics at all, I really, really liked it. And that's how I ended up kind of starting to learn more and more about the brain.
All right. Um, one last question. Um, are the extracellular matrix components actually made of?
So it's made out of a mix of I don't know how familiar you are with like the four main categories of like biomolecules or whatnot, right? There's fats, there's proteins, there's starches, and there's darn, what's the last one? I forget. But the brain basically is made out of all of them. So proteins kind of help form your backbones. They're a little stiffer. Starches, actually, we usually think of them as fuel sources, but they also tend to hold on to water really well. And so sometimes we'll attach starches onto our proteins to help hold water. there's a lot of fats as well in your brain. So, for instance, all your axons have fat around it, and it's also a nice cushioning material. And then there's also just like molecules in general. We talk about these signaling molecules and things like that. So there's molecules that float around that tell other cells stuff, or molecules that will go and eat certain things. So be able to, prune and keep everything tidy, basically. So there's like a lot of different parts.
Right. So those are all the main questions. Thank you, Cynthia, for presenting. Thank you, everyone, for coming to listen and participating. Yeah, so we will end there. Um, yeah. Lom, do you have anything to add?
No, thank you so much, Cynthia. Yeah, so providing this amazing talk, and I think that everybody loved it. Yeah,
I'm glad. I hope you all go on to study the extracellular matrix in the brain when you go to college and beyond. Just remember this talk. And thank you, everyone, for coming too.
right. If you grow up to be a Nobel Prize winner, remember this Cynthia Lo, okay? All right, bye everyone.
Bye.